Now, in the previous video, I talked about how it would be the West, the American West, where the first migrations of Asians to the United States would find themselves, right? In the American West during the 19th century and into the 20th century. And when we think about the American West, we have, most of us at least, have this, if you will, romanticized version or depiction or imagination of what the West was about during this time we're talking about. That is to say, the 1800s. And largely, this is a result of Western culture, right? Think, for example, of the Western movies, right? Especially those black and white ones, right? Where you have cowboys roaming around, symbols of, if you will, autonomy and independence, right? And then they're in constant conflict with Indians, of course. So this again is this imagination as this untamed Wild West, right, compared to the tamed and civilized East, so to say. Well, this is the traditional view, okay, of the West as indicated in the slide. And with the traditional view, you have to say that there are some misconceptions, if not exaggerated views about the West. I kind of alluded to some already, but here's a short list, right? That the West, for example, was vacant of settlement, right? That it was virtually unpopulated and it was open land for American settlers to move from, east to west in this westward expansion. Another misconception, or actually an exaggeration, is that the pioneers that came over were these heroic frontiersmen, frontierswomen, and they're just exploring for just the sake of exploration itself, right? Exploring for its own sake. And this is part of that American tradition again, right? Just dealing with uncharted territory and settling the frontier, right? This idea of the frontier. Again, there's an element of truth to that, of course. They're very courageous people coming over, but that's not simply what it was all about. This is perhaps too simplistic. Still another, and I have to say this is a misconception, a wrong idea about the West was that the West was completely separate from the East. And again, you get this notion when you watch those old Westerns. The idea that the West is this, again, Wild West, and it's completely cut off, right, from the East. All right, so this is, again, a traditional view. It's, again, highly romanticized. And what modern historians have done is actually teach us that, this is largely, again, overblown, exaggerated, if not misconceived. In actual truth, what westward expansion was all about is commercial expansion. Okay, now this deserves some discussion because we're talking about Asians going to the West. And they're not going there to explore or to be pioneers. No, they're going there to work. They constitute a cheap labor force. We have to link that with the previous discussion we just had, right? So what are they doing there? It's because of the presence of capitalist industries in the West. All right, so the way to really think about the West is not the aforementioned way I just said that's attached to our culture, but the idea that the West is not separate from the East. Actually, it's an extension of the East. It's one process, one movement west, okay, with no demarcation line. All right, you have to imagine capitalist sort of dynamism, right? A real dynamic capitalism happening in the factories in the East, like in Boston and New York and Pittsburgh and even the Midwest like Chicago. But you have to imagine the market spreading west from those areas, right? And it's one flow. It's one expansion of capital, right? As I mentioned, this is capitalist expansion. So again, the West was not separate from the East. It's actually an extension of it. And you need labor in the West, right? And moreover, we know that you need the cheapest labor in order to maximize your profit. So here is where you see the place of Asians in the West. When you think about this whole dynamic I've just laid out, um, it is going to be Western industry, that will recruit labor from abroad. And again, that's that connection to race. When you think about people coming from abroad as your cheap labor force, they're not Americans, right? They're different races. So, in the case of the Asians coming over during the 19th and early 20th century, the particular industries that are going to attract them are mining. Early on, we've heard of the 49ers, right? And the gold rush and all that stuff. And then we'll see them, the Chinese, we'll see them recruited into railroad industry to build the Intercontinental Railroad. And then we'll see them employed at the same time, as a railroad in the field of agribusiness. Agribusiness, again, refers to agriculture as big business, right? The commercialization of the food we eat, something we take for granted today because we don't grow our food in our backyard, right? We don't have farms where we cultivate crops. We go to routes. We go to a drive-through or a restaurant. It's the market where we buy our food. And here's where we see that process really beginning during the 1800s is when big business basically takes over the food industry and leads to the end of that small family farm that was self-sustaining, right? Okay, so the next thing we need to talk about is, how did the Chinese, or even why did the Chinese come to the U.S. as cheap labor? What were the forces involved? So when we ask the question, why were the Chinese going to the U.S. West during the mid-1800s? Why were the later Japanese pulled to the American West as well later on in this century? Well, there's a specific historical logic at work here. And by the way, this will apply to other Asian groups later, okay, that will come, in other words, in the successive decades, like Filipinos and Koreans and so forth. But here's that historical logic. The reason why you see Chinese labor ending up in the American West is because American recruiters went to China first. Okay, it's almost like a reflexive action, right? American recruiters and just Western recruiters in general, meaning, the West, like Europe, right? Europe and the Western world. You see Western recruiters in parts of China trying to recruit the Chinese as cheap labor. All right, so they're actively seeking it because, they'll save a lot of money, as we mentioned, if they could cut their labor drastically. So when we analyze immigration here, by the way, and as noted on the slide here, I differentiate between push and pull factors behind Chinese immigration. What does this refer to? Well, when we think about push factors, they refer to those factors that influence immigration of any migrant group, right? Whether it's the Chinese or, let's say, Syrian refugees in current history. Any migratory group usually has push and pull factors. So again, the push factors are those factors that are shaping immigration that are located in the migrant's place of origin, or their home country, if you will. And that's opposed to pull factors. Pull factors are those factors shaping or influencing migration that are found in the migrant's place of settlement, in the host country. So again, when you think of any migratory group in history or even today, in current times, you should always consider push and pull factors. That way you get a more nuanced understanding, a more complete picture about the nature of migration, whether we're talking about, let's say, immigrants coming from south of the border of our country, or again the Syrian war that was especially heightened a few years ago, and what have you. Okay, so when we consider the push and pull factors that's going to precipitate Chinese immigration to the West, we notice that in China at the time, you have tremendous political upheaval. Um, During the 19th century, this was a time where the Qing Empire, okay, which was the dominant empire there in China, it's spelled Qing, Qing, was actually in a state of upheaval because you see a lot of revolt against the Qing Empire. The Qing, in ethnic terms, were not Han Chinese, Han Chinese. Okay, what do I mean by that? They're actually foreigners, but they came down from the north, where they originate from, and decided to, colonize, if you will, China. Okay, and they were around for centuries. But now you see their decline, and indeed, you'll see the last emperor by, the early 20th century. But that's another history in itself. But during the 19th century, you see a host of revolts and upheavals, and you couple that with the various natural disasters, right, like famine and so forth. Of course, this is going to lead to mass poverty, and you see migrants desperately trying to escape poverty and starvation. But also added to this picture is the heavy presence of Western recruiters. And let me go to the next slide here. They're going to be located in one specific part of China here. And that's this area called the Guangdong province, okay? Obviously marked in red here. Now, in this area, during the 19th century, it is the most commercialized area in the entire China, right? The entire kingdom. Most of China at this time, needless to say, is agricultural, composed of peasants, right? It's feudal primarily, but in this area, you do see Western presence here, right? You see Western commerce. Now, when I say Western, I mean European nations as well as the United States, right? Western powers, Western civilization, and so forth. Okay, so they're there and they're trying to make inroads into China to take advantage of China as a market for, Western goods. So they're already there, and they have recruiters there that are going to attempt to, again, recruit cheap labor in China. Okay, so you have to consider that as a push factor because they're literally located in, the home country of China, even though they originate somewhere else, but they're literally in China. So interesting to note that most of the Chinese laborers coming to the U.S. West will be from one particular area here, the Guangdong province. And by the way, even today, it is the most commercial area of China. We know that China is undergoing its own intensive industrial revolution as we speak. In fact, now I believe it finds itself in the top in terms of economic importers, of all the countries in the world. Think about going to Walmart and finding everything made in China. Well, that wasn't around 3 decades ago. They had their own industrial revolution. But most or a big part of their economic vibrancy and vitality are found here in the Guangdong province, even today. In fact, that's in Shenzhen. That is to say, that's where the Foxconn factory is located that makes all the Apple products. Okay. All right, so that's the Guangdong province, and again, it's going to be the source of the local inhabitants of this. It's a large area, but still local inhabitants of the Chinese who find themselves ending up in the American West as cheap labor. Now, when it comes to pull factors, again, those are the factors that are found in the new place of settlement. And here is an interesting thing here, Gold Mountain. What's this? Well, These Western recruiters basically fabricated ideas about what these laborers would find if they volunteered, to sign the contract and become this labor force and go east across the Pacific into the U.S. West. They promised them that they would find so much gold. I mean, they made up lies like, oh, yeah, the gold grows on trees, the streets are paved with gold, you could just grab it, right? Well, needless to say, if you are poor and you're desperate, this is going to serve as a tremendous enticement for you to sign that contract and saying, I am going and I need to get rich, right? So the name that the Chinese laborers affixed to the U.S. West was, quote, Gold Mountain. Okay, and it's exactly because of the boosters and recruiters who are trying to recruit the labor, right? They're fabricating these tales about what they'd find. Now, of course, you can imagine the disappointment when the Chinese get there and they find no paved streets of gold, but they are sent to the mines to, work in the gold mines, right? But they're working as wage laborers, not many of them, right? Not all of them, but many of them are working as miners, as wage laborers for the mining industry. Okay, so obviously it's the American West where they could find a place where they could escape from poverty and even achieve some upward social mobility. And indeed, many of them would send money home, their wages, right, send it back to China as a remittance to improve the lot of their family and so forth. And, this is actually an immigrant tale today where many families come here as immigrants and they send money back home to help their family in their original country, right? Okay, so these are the push and pull factors that explain Chinese immigration.